Winter came early to the American plains. The fire was burning, but the house stayed cold. Everyone believed this was normal, until one quiet idea challenged everything they thought they knew about survival. Before the story begins, write in the comments where you're watching from. If you enjoy real stories of resilience and unexpected solutions, like the video and subscribe to the channel. The winter arrived without ceremony, as it often did on the open plains of North Dakota. There was no dramatic announcement, no single night when autumn clearly surrendered. Instead, the land simply hardened. The sky grew pale and distant. The grass lost its color, and the wind, always present, began to carry something sharper within it. By late November of 1936, the wind no longer merely passed through the farmland. It stayed, pressed against the earth, and refused to leave. Tommy Reed felt it first inside his house. His farm stood alone on a stretch of flat land, several miles from the nearest town. There were no trees close enough to break the wind, no hills to slow it down. The house was a practical structure, built years earlier with speed and necessity in mind, rather than comfort. Wooden walls, simple framing, a pitched roof, and a single iron stove placed near the center of the main room. It was the kind of house hundreds of farmers lived in across the plains. It was considered adequate. By the time the temperature dropped below -20 degrees Fahrenheit, adequacy became a fragile word. Tommy woke before dawn every morning to feed the stove. He had learned to sleep lightly, his body trained to recognize the particular silence that meant the fire was dying. If he waited too long, the cold would take hold of the house quickly. The stove radiated intense heat within a few feet, but beyond that small circle, the warmth faded, as if swallowed by the walls themselves. He pulled on his boots and coat and crossed the room, his breath already visible. The floorboards were stiff with cold, and each step sent a dull ache through the soles of his feet. He opened the stove door, shoveled in more wood, and watched the flames catch. The iron began to glow faintly, promising warmth that never quite reached where it was needed most. Near the stove, the air became almost oppressive after a few minutes, but in the corners of the room, frost clung to the baseboards. The walls felt cold to the touch, as if the wind lived inside them. The bedroom at the back of the house never truly warmed. Tommy slept there, wrapped in layers of blankets, his breath fogging the air until morning. Water left in a bucket overnight developed a thin layer of ice by sunrise, sometimes thicker. Tommy learned to keep it close to the stove, though even that was no guarantee during the coldest nights. The wind never stopped. It pressed against the house from all sides, slipping through every unseen gap, every joint where wood met wood. It howled across the fields and rattled the windows until the glass trembled in its frame. At night, the sound became constant, like something alive circling the house, testing it. Tommy had lived on this land long enough to know that fighting the wind was pointless. You endured it. Everyone did. In town, people spoke of the cold the same way they spoke of droughts or bad harvests, with resignation. Cold was part of life here. You burned more wood. You wore thicker coats. You learned not to complain. So Tommy did what he was supposed to do. He cut wood until his arms ached. He stacked it neatly along the side of the house, watching the pile shrink faster than he liked. He kept the stove burning day and night, feeding it every few hours, even when exhaustion pulled at him harder than the cold. Still, the house refused to stay warm. There was something deeply unsettling about that. The fire was real. He could see it, feel it scorch his skin when he stood too close. Yet the warmth seemed to vanish the moment it left the stove's surface. It rushed upward, drawn into the chimney, or simply dissolved into the cold walls and floors. Tommy found himself standing near the stove more often than he cared to admit, lingering there longer than necessary, just to feel alive again. The rest of the house became a place to move through quickly, not to inhabit. At night, he lay awake, listening to the wind, feeling the cold creep back as the fire settled into embers. He wondered how long his wood supply would last if the winter worsened. He wondered how many nights like this lay ahead. The radio crackled with reports of falling temperatures across the region. Another cold front moving in. Stronger winds. No relief in sight. By early December, the cold had become something more than discomfort. It was a constant calculation. How much wood remained. How often the stove needed feeding. How cold the far side of the house would become before morning. Neighbors spoke of similar struggles. In the feed store, men compared frostbite scars and shared tips that had been passed down for generations. Keep the stove going, block the windows, hang blankets over doorways, except that winter owned the land for now. No one questioned the stove. No one questioned the walls. Cold was simply something you lived with. One evening, as darkness settled early and the wind rose again, Tommy stood in the center of his house and turned slowly, taking it all in. The stove roared behind him, radiating fierce heat. His back felt warm. His face did not. The far wall looked distant, hostile, as if it belonged to another building entirely. The house was shelter from snow and rain. It kept the wind outside mostly, but it did not protect him from the cold. Not really. That realization unsettled him more than the temperature itself. Because if fire was not enough and walls were not enough, then something fundamental about the way the house worked was wrong, and winter, relentless and patient, was beginning to expose it. As the wind screamed across the plains and the stove devoured another armful of wood, Tommy Reed stood alone in his farmhouse, unaware that the solution to his problem would not come from more fire, but from a question no one around him was asking yet. And winter was only just beginning. Lillian Crawford arrived in town on a morning when the wind carried snow sideways across the road. The bus left her at the edge of the main street, its engine coughing before disappearing into the white distance. She stood there alone for a moment, holding her coat tight around her, studying the place that was now supposed to be her home. The town was small, even by North Dakota standards. A handful of wooden buildings, a feed store, a church, a schoolhouse, and houses scattered beyond them like afterthoughts. Everything looked as if it had been placed where it was most convenient, not where it was most comfortable. The land did not invite decoration or softness. It demanded practicality. Lillian understood that immediately. She was not from here. Everyone could see that. Her coat was city-made, her boots still stiff from lack of use. She spoke carefully, listened more than she talked, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that did not quite fit the place. People noticed. They always did in towns like this. She had come from Minneapolis to teach at the local school, accepting a position that others had turned down without hesitation. Most people saw the plains as empty and unforgiving. Lillian saw them as honest. There was no illusion here, no comfort that did not earn its place. Her first weeks passed quietly. She taught children whose hands were already rough from chores, whose attention drifted toward the windows whenever the wind rose. She learned which roads became impassable after snowfall and which houses stayed dark longest in the evenings. She listened. That was how she noticed the cold, not as a stranger might with shock or complaint, but as an observer. She saw how people lived around it, how they accepted it as fixed and unchangeable. Houses were built to stand, not to hold warmth. Fires were fed endlessly, as if the act itself was proof of survival. One evening, she was invited to Tommy Reed's farmhouse. The invitation was casual, almost reluctant, as if hospitality itself were another chore added to an already long list. Lillian accepted without hesitation. Tommy's house was exactly as she expected. Simple, functional, tired. She felt the temperature change the moment she stepped inside. Near the stove, the air was thick and hot, almost suffocating. A few steps away, the warmth thinned noticeably. By the time she reached the far wall, the cold returned, sharp and immediate. Tommy noticed her pause. "Stove's doing its best," he said, not defensively, just stating a fact. "Gets worse when the wind picks up." Lilian nodded, but did not answer right away. She set down her coat and moved slowly through the room, paying attention to how the air felt against her skin. She placed her hand against the wall. It was cold, not cool. Cold, as if it had never known heat at all. They sat near the stove with mugs of coffee. The iron creaked as the fire shifted inside. Lilian listened to Tommy talk about his farm, about the winter, about how much wood he was burning already, and how much he worried it wouldn't be enough. Finally, she spoke. "It's strange," she said. Tommy looked at her. "What is?" "You have plenty of fire," she said, "but no warmth." He frowned slightly. "That's winter here." "Not exactly," Lilian replied. "That's heat without storage." The words sounded out of place in the small room. Tommy studied her face, trying to decide whether she was joking. "The stove's hot," he said. "That's all it's meant to do." "That's all it can do," she corrected gently. "It burns. It doesn't remember." He didn't understand, and she could see that clearly. So she explained, slowly, without assuming knowledge he didn't have. She told him about her grandfather, a builder who believed that fire was only half the solution. Heat, she said, needed something to stay in, something heavy, something patient. Walls that didn't just block wind, but absorbed warmth and gave it back over time. "Right now," she said, gesturing around the room, "your fire works hard, and your house works against it." Tommy leaned back in his chair, listening, skeptical but curious. He had lived with this cold his entire life. The idea that the house itself might be part of the problem felt almost insulting. Outside, the wind struck the side of the house again, hard enough to rattle the windows. Lilian didn't flinch. "The walls are thin," she continued. "They don't hold anything. Heat touches them and disappears. You could burn twice as much wood and it wouldn't change that." "That's how houses are built here," Tommy said. "I know," she replied. "That doesn't mean it's the only way." Word traveled quickly in town, as it always did. By the next day, people were already talking about the new teacher, about the strange things she said, about the idea that the cold wasn't something to endure, but something to solve. Some laughed. "She thinks she knows winter," one man said at the feed store. "Give her a month." Others shrugged it off. People had survived like this for generations. Changing it felt unnecessary, maybe even foolish. Lilian heard the comments but didn't respond to them. She had learned long ago that arguing with habit was a waste of energy. Instead, she waited. The winter grew harsher. The wind strengthened. Snow piled against buildings and fences until they disappeared into the landscape. The stove in Tommy's house burned nearly non-stop, yet the cold persisted, seeping into places fire could not reach. One evening, after another long day of feeding the stove, Tommy stood by the far wall again, feeling the cold radiate back at him. Lilian's words returned to him, uninvited and persistent. "The house works against the fire." For the first time, he wondered if that was true. And if it was, he wondered what would happen if the house itself could be made to remember warmth instead of letting it escape into the wind. The decision did not arrive suddenly. It formed slowly, the way frost crept across the inside of a window, almost invisible until it covered everything. Tommy Reed did not wake one morning convinced. He arrived there through exhaustion. By mid-December, the cold no longer felt temporary. It had settled into the land, with the confidence of something that intended to stay. The wind sharpened, cutting across the plains without resistance, pressing against the farmhouse night and day. Snow drifted against the walls and packed itself into corners that were never meant to hold it. Tommy burned wood constantly. He fed the stove before dawn, again at midday, again at night. Sometimes he woke in the dark just to make sure the fire had not fallen too low. Even so, the house refused to cooperate. Heat gathered around the stove and went no farther. The rest of the space remained stiff and unwelcoming, as if it resented every effort made to warm it. Lilian visited often. She did not pressure him. She simply observed, occasionally pointing out details he had learned to ignore. The way the air cooled the moment you stepped away from the stove, the way the walls felt colder after sunset than they did in the morning, the way warmth never seemed to linger. One evening, after a particularly bitter day, Tommy set another log into the stove and watched the flames take hold. He waited, counting the minutes, feeling the heat bloom behind him. Then he turned and walked toward the far wall. Nothing changed. He stood there for a long time, his breath visible, his boots planted on frozen floorboards. The stove worked. The fire was real. But the house remained indifferent. That night, he made his decision. They began the next morning. Lilian brought notebooks filled with rough sketches and handwritten notes passed down through her family. Tommy brought shovels, buckets, and a growing sense that he might be wasting time he could not afford to lose. Outside, neighbors watched with open curiosity as the two of them measured the space beside the stove and marked the floor with chalk. "What are you building?" someone asked. "A wall," Tommy replied. That earned laughter. They worked with what the land offered. Clay from a low bank near the creek, hauled back in heavy loads. Sand from the same place. Old straw left over from the fall harvest. Stones gathered from fence lines and frozen fields. Lilian mixed the first batch herself, kneeling on the floor, working the clay until it softened beneath her hands. Tommy watched skeptically as she added sand, then straw, explaining each step as she went. "Too much clay cracks," she said. "Too much sand crumbles. The straw holds it together." They built the wall slowly, layer by layer, thick and deliberate. It rose beside the stove, nearly 1/2 meter deep, heavy even before it dried. Inside, they shaped narrow channels, leaving space for hot air to pass through before escaping upward toward the chimney. The work was cold and exhausting. Their hands numbed quickly, and they took breaks near the stove just to feel their fingers again. Each evening, they covered the unfinished wall to protect it from freezing too quickly. The first cracks appeared on the third day. Tommy noticed them early in the morning, thin lines running across the surface like veins. His chest tightened. He had expected this, and yet it felt like confirmation of every doubt he had tried to ignore. "It's drying too fast," Lilian said calmly. "We rushed it." They tore out the damaged section and mixed a new batch, adjusting the ratio, adding more straw. This time they worked slower. They let the wall rest. They kept it damp during the day and protected it at night. Neighbors continued to stop by. Some shook their heads and walked away without speaking. Others stayed longer, offering unsolicited advice that came from habit rather than understanding. "You'd be warmer if you just fed the stove," one man said. Tommy did not argue. He worked. The wind did not stop. It hammered against the house as if aware that something inside was changing. Snow crept along the base of the new wall, melting slightly where the stove's heat touched it, then freezing again. Progress was slow. Every mistake cost time, and time was something winter did not forgive easily. More than once, Tommy considered abandoning the effort. The wall consumed space. It consumed energy, and there was no guarantee it would do anything at all. But each time doubt crept in, He remembered standing at the far wall, feeling nothing but cold. By early January, the wall stood complete. It was rough, uneven, nothing like the smooth, plastered surfaces Lilian had described from her grandfather's notes. But it was solid, heavy, real. They waited. The first true test came on a night when the temperature dropped sharply, colder than it had been all season. Tommy fed the stove as usual, then stepped back. Heat flowed into the room, pressing against the new wall. He placed his hand against it and felt only coolness at first. Hours passed. The fire died down. Tommy resisted the urge to add more wood. He sat near the stove, listening to the wind claw at the house, expecting the cold to reclaim the space as it always did. It did not. The air remained steady, not hot, but not biting either. The floor did not stiffen beneath his feet. The far wall no longer felt like an enemy. He slept without waking to feed the stove. In the morning, he rose cautiously, half expecting disappointment. The stove was cold. No embers remained, yet the room held its warmth. The wall beside the stove felt alive beneath his palm, releasing heat slowly, deliberately. Tommy stood there in silence, understanding settling over him piece by piece. The fire had not changed. The house had. Outside, the wind continued to howl across the plains, indifferent as ever. But inside the farmhouse, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time that winter, warmth stayed when the fire was gone, and word began to spread. The cold did not retreat after that night. If anything, it grew more determined, as if offended by resistance. January settled over North Dakota, with a severity that people would remember for years, speaking of it later in careful tones. Temperatures dropped further, the sky remaining a pale, hard gray for days at a time. Snow no longer fell gently. It arrived driven sideways by the wind, compacting itself against buildings until doors had to be forced open. In other houses, stoves burned without rest. Smoke curled from chimneys day and night, thick and constant, yet the warmth inside those homes remained fragile. People moved from room to room quickly, shoulders hunched, breath visible even indoors. Water froze if left unattended. Food stored against outer walls hardened overnight. Sleep came in short, uncomfortable stretches, interrupted by the need to feed fires that never seemed satisfied. At Tommy Reed's farmhouse, the routine changed quietly. He still lit the stove each morning. That did not change. But instead of feeding it endlessly, he burned the fire hot and steady for a short time, just long enough for the heat to sink into the thick wall beside it. When the iron stove glowed and the wall no longer felt cold to the touch, he closed the vents and let the fire fade. Then he waited. Hours passed. The wind battered the house as it always had, probing for weakness. But inside, the temperature barely shifted. The heat did not vanish upward or dissolve into the walls. It stayed, released slowly from the mass that now stood between the fire and the rest of the house. Tommy noticed it first in small ways. His hands no longer stiffened when he moved away from the stove. The floor remained tolerable beneath his boots. The far wall, once a source of constant cold, felt neutral, almost welcoming. At night, he sat at the table without pulling his coat tighter around himself. He slept without waking to tend the fire. When morning came, the stove was cold, but the room was not. Lilian visited often, observing quietly. She touched the wall, checked the air near the ceiling and along the floor, watching how the heat distributed itself evenly instead of pooling in one place. She smiled only once, briefly, when she saw Tommy stand in the middle of the room and turn slowly, as if confirming that what he felt was real. Outside, people began to notice. Neighbors passing by paused longer than usual when they saw smoke rise from Tommy's chimney only once a day. Some stopped to ask casual questions, disguising curiosity as politeness. Tommy answered simply. He did not explain more than necessary. He had learned that warmth spoke for itself. One evening, a neighbor stayed longer than planned. He sat near the stove, then stood and moved toward the far wall, frowning when he realized the temperature barely changed. "It's warmer than mine," he said quietly, "and I've been burning all day." Others followed. They came under the pretense of conversation, of checking in, of borrowing tools. They stayed because the house felt different, not hot, stable, safe. The wind could scream as loudly as it liked outside, but inside the farmhouse it no longer mattered. The laughter stopped. Questions replaced it. "How often do you feed the stove? How much wood do you use? Why does the heat stay?" Tommy answered honestly. "Once a day. Less wood than before, because the wall holds it." Some nodded slowly, trying to fit the idea into what they already believed. Others remained skeptical, but none laughed anymore. The cold reached its peak in late January. The wind scoured the plains relentlessly, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin within seconds. In town, people moved quickly between buildings, heads down, faces wrapped. Houses glowed with stove light late into the night, as fires were kept alive at all costs. At Tommy's farmhouse, the stove had been lit that morning and left alone by midday. By evening, the wall continued to release warmth steadily. The air inside remained calm and even, untouched by the violence outside. Neighbors arrived without embarrassment now. They came to warm their hands, to sit quietly, to feel what they could not create in their own homes. Some stayed long after their cups were empty, reluctant to return to the cold that waited for them. No one argued anymore. What mattered was not whose idea it had been, or whether it came from books or tradition. What mattered was that it worked. As January dragged on, the farmhouse became a quiet reference point, not a place of spectacle, but of proof. People left carrying new thoughts with them, turning over possibilities as they walked back into the wind. The wall stood silently, doing what it was built to do. It did not glow. It did not demand attention. It simply remembered the fire long after the flames were gone. And in the depths of a winter that tested every assumption people had about survival on the plains, that memory made all the difference. Spring did not arrive suddenly. It never did on the northern plains. The cold loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, retreating in stages rather than surrendering all at once. The wind softened first, losing its edge, though it never fully disappeared. Snow began to shrink back into the ground instead of piling higher, and the sky regained hints of color that had been absent for months. By the time the thaw truly began, something else had already changed in the town. What started in Tommy Reed's farmhouse did not stay there. It couldn't. People had felt the difference with their own bodies. They had stood in a house where the fire was out and the warmth remained. That experience followed them home, settled into their thoughts, and refused to be ignored. No one announced a movement. No one gave it a name. There were no meetings, no speeches, no declarations that things would now be done differently. The change spread quietly, the way practical knowledge always did in places where survival mattered more than pride. The first new wall went up in a neighboring house before February ended. It was rougher than Tommy's, built with less patience and more uncertainty. It cracked in places, and part of it had to be rebuilt. Still, it worked better than the stove alone ever had. Then another appeared, and another. By the time the snow began to melt in earnest, several houses in town carried the same unmistakable mark inside their walls. Thick, earthen structures placed beside stoves, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. No two were exactly alike, Each reflected the hands and habits of the people who built them, but the principle was the same: burn less, hold more. Tommy found himself answering questions more often than he expected. People came to him not as skeptics anymore, but as students. He explained what he knew, carefully, honestly, never pretending expertise he did not have. When he didn't know the answer, Lilian often did, and when she didn't, they worked it out together. Lilian remained the same through it all. She never claimed credit. She never corrected people who assumed the idea had been Tommy's. Her satisfaction came from watching understanding take root where resignation once lived. At the schoolhouse, children listened differently now when she spoke about problem solving. They had seen it with their own eyes. They had sat in warm rooms while the wind howled outside. The lesson was no longer abstract. The town itself did not change much on the surface. It was still small, still practical, still shaped by weather and work. But something fundamental had shifted beneath that simplicity. People stopped talking about cold as if it were an unavoidable enemy. They began talking about it as a challenge. Tommy noticed the difference most clearly the following winter. The cold returned, as it always did, but it no longer brought the same sense of quiet dread. Woodpiles lasted longer. Fires burned with purpose instead of desperation. Houses felt lived in, not merely endured. The wall beside his stove remained where it was, bearing the marks of its making. It had cracks now, small and harmless, signs of time and use. Tommy liked them. They reminded him that nothing built to last came without effort. On certain evenings, when the wind rose again and darkness settled early, neighbors still came by. Not because they needed rescue, but because warmth had become something to share rather than hoard. They sat, talked, and listened to the steady silence of a house that no longer fought itself. Lilian stayed in town longer than she had planned. Teaching led to more teaching, not just in the classroom, but everywhere people asked questions. She found that she belonged there more than she had expected. The plains had a way of revealing what mattered, stripping life down to essentials. One evening, late in the season, Tommy stood alone in his house as the last of the snow melted outside. The stove was cold. The wall beside it held a faint warmth from the morning fire, slowly fading into the room. He placed his hand against it and closed his eyes. The house was quiet. Not the uneasy quiet of cold, but the calm of balance. He thought back to the beginning of winter, to the nights when the fire burned endlessly and still failed him, to the belief that suffering was simply part of the bargain, unchangeable and unquestioned. He realized now how heavy that belief had been. Nothing about the land had changed. The wind still crossed the plains without mercy. The cold still arrived each year with the same certainty. What had changed was the way people responded to it. They had stopped assuming that tradition was always right. They had learned that survival was not just about endurance, but about understanding, about observing what failed and having the courage to ask why, about accepting that sometimes the answer did not come from more effort, but from a different way of thinking. The wall beside the stove did not look impressive. It would never be admired by strangers or written about in newspapers. It was not an invention meant for recognition. It was simply a solution. And in a place where winter punished every mistake, that was more than enough. This story reminds us that survival is not only about endurance, but about understanding. If this story made you think differently, support the channel with a like and subscribe for more true stories like this. And don't forget to write in the comments where you're watching from.